Hi and welcome to Best in Tesla. So I came across this video from Sky News about Carmageddon. Thanks to Ellen for pointing this video out to me. But this really shows the trouble the old automakers are in, and not just from a Tesla fanboy, and why China is so dominating and has leapfrogged everyone else as a car exporter in no time at all, and how the legacy automakers has been betting on the wrong technologies, and how their lack of expertise in battery technology and software skills are leaving them in the dust of Tesla and the Chinese. But even the Chinese cannot keep up with Tesla when it comes to battery technology. Even though Tesla is using their batteries, they are still making battery stories that are 4 times better than the Chinese, according to a new study. But they don't talk about Tesla in this report from Sky News, so I thought we would go through this little 5-minute video, as it does have a lot of great stuff in it, and add some context about Tesla into the mix as well, as Carmageddon is truly unfolding for the legacy automakers, and there is not much they can do about it. So let's check it all out and let's dive right in.
What is going on with the UK, the European, the US car industry right now? It feels almost, you might say, like Carmageddon. And it's a lot of people are talking about things like Brexit, about political interventions, but actually there's something bigger going on. So I want to take you on a deep dive here through some of the data, and we'll start with the big picture, okay? This is showing you the biggest car producers, car exporters around the world, okay, in terms of how much they're sending out exports. So you've got Japan, you've got Germany, you've got South Korea, the US in recent years. And the big shift we're seeing at the moment is down to the change in cars. So from internal combustion engine cars to electric cars. And look at the biggest beneficiary of that. Look at China. Just look at how it's leapfrogged everyone else in terms of the units of cars they're sending out around the world. What is going on there? Well, part of the story, kind of the big picture here, is it is much cheaper right now to make electric cars in China, okay? So this is showing you the cost of making a VW i3, okay, ID3. This is the car that's comparable to certain cars that you can find in China. And this is showing you the different component parts, so the battery, the chassis, and so on. And now let's compare that with a BYD Seal. So this is a not dissimilar car in China. 29% cheaper to make in China, the battery. But also look at the other parts as well. All of them cheaper in China. Okay, and the upshot of that is you're talking about cheaper cars. And why is it cheaper? Well, partly it's down to expertise, partly it's down to other things as well. So for instance, consider the fact that you have more state aid in China. So subsidies, visible and invisible. Certainly there are subsidies that go to UK and EU producers as well. But the Chinese subsidies, and this is across the sector, it's not looking at a specific company, across the sector are significantly higher, up to 9 times more state aid than you find in the OECD, which is the developed world. So you've got state aid, the government helping out.
Yes, we can see the ID3 made in Germany is about almost 30% more expensive than the BYD Seal made in China, as the Chinese also get about 9 times more aid from their government. So this is of course one of the reasons why they are so dominating and killing the legacy automakers in China. But this is what China has done so many times before in many other industries, like they have done with the solar industry, undercutting everyone else and scaling up rapidly, making sure the others could not compete and go out of business. And that is why China sits on somewhere between 80 to 90% of all solar production in the world today, and 40 to 50% of all glass made today as well. There are so many examples of China's way of undercutting the competition and scaling up fast to get the dominating market share of whatever industry they set their mind to. And now it is the car industry of the future, battery electric vehicles.
You've also got tariffs in China as well, by the way. You've got power costs that are much higher here in Europe than they are elsewhere around the world. In fact, look, of all of the countries, the industrial power costs are highest in the UK. And if you're thinking about where you're going to put your factory, that really matters because, it's a big component part of your costs if you're making a car. So you've got power costs higher as well. Whereas in China, usually a lot of the power comes from coal and that's a lot cheaper. Now, there's also something else going on here, which is about the kind of change in industrial architecture we're talking about here. Typically, historically, and this is showing you just the component parts of a car, and this is a combustion engine car, and how much of the costs they comprise. The engine has typically been the hardest thing to build. It's really hard building engines, really, really hard. Actually, China's really struggled to build engines historically because you've got lots of component parts, a lot of work, a lot of skill goes into that 21%. And actually, that's the biggest part by far. However, now look with batteries, it changes the complete ratio here. The battery becomes by far and away the biggest cost, 39%, even more. And making a battery is a very different skill to making an engine. You can't just take these jobs and shift them across there. And that's a real conundrum for people making cars in Europe and indeed in the US.
Yes, 39% of the cost of an EV comes from its batteries. And that battery price is constantly going down, as they have been for the last 30 years. But not only have the price come down, but the energy density has also been rising through the last 30 years. And both things will continue. Batteries are as bad and expensive as they will ever be today. They will only get better and cheaper in the future, making the most expensive part of an EV become cheaper and cheaper. Also because the energy density continues to rise, the less battery you need in an EV, making them even cheaper yet again. And we see that the materials for batteries themselves is also dropping fast in price right now, as something like lithium has dropped 86%. This could also have something to do with all the legacy automaker that has been promising the skies with the EV ramp, but none of them have delivered. They have ordered batteries for millions of EVs, but are now cancelling all those big orders as their EVs did not sell as well as they hoped. So now the battery manufacturer has to cancel their orders to the mining companies, making an oversupply for materials in the industry, pushing down the prices. And we also see the cobalt is dropping in price over 40% as the demand for these type of batteries is no longer as high, as most EV makers are shifting to LFP batteries. But we will talk more about that in a moment. And the core competency for the EV maker is, of course, their battery technology. The trouble for the old guys is, of course, that their core competency is making ICE engines and then assembling all those components from all their suppliers to a car.
And it's part of the explanation for why right now China is dominant when it comes to making electric cars. 65% of the global market is Chinese. But what's interesting is when you look beneath that, look into the supply chain, look at how many people are making batteries. It's 82% of the market for batteries is China. Look deeper, look at the components that go inside the batteries. That's dominated even more by China. So the anodes, the cathodes, that's 87, 96% with the anode made in China. You see, it's Chinese dominance. So even if you're making a battery, you're still having to get your components from China, and it goes on. So the chemicals, largely made in China. Really the only area where you don't see the red bars, that's Chinese proportions, where you don't see the red bars as high, it's mining, because you can't control where the lithium and the cobalt is actually coming out of the ground. That's a geological issue.
It's wild to think that 65% of the global EV market is in China. It really puts in perspective how big that market has already become in China, and why the Chinese market is so important for every EV maker on the planet to have success in. And that is what we are seeing with the German automakers. They are not having success in the Chinese EV market, and that is why they are desperately trying to find ways to get a foothold, like Audi, which is trying to rebrand themselves in the country. And when looking at their sales of the e-tron GT in the country, you kind of understand why. The sales of the e-tron GT has basically died. So Audi really need to do something to get their BEV sales up in China, or they are losing out on about 65% of the market right now, which is very critical if you want to grow your EV business and gain market share before it's too late. But China really has a big advantage with having 82% of the market for batteries. 82% of all batteries in the world are made in China. But the materials that goes into the batteries are even more dominated by China, as we could see in these charts. But that will change over time as more and more EVs are going to be recycled in the local markets around the world, making sure that those materials stays in the region. But for now, China is the dominating force when it comes to battery materials. But when we have millions of EVs being recycled every year, 20 years out in the future, that will change China's dominance on the materials, as the materials will enter the circular economy, and why recycling batteries are so important for the US and Europe to not be so dependent on China for the materials in the future. And there is a lot to gain, as Redwood Materials also shared on X back in November. Despite being one of the largest consumers of lithium-ion batteries in the world, the US only recycles about 5% of them. So there is about 95% improvements to be had on that front, and like JB Straubel once said, that they already see an excess of cobalt from recycling batteries, not only because more and more LFP batteries are used in the car industry today, but also the fact that less cobalt is needed because the batteries are getting better and better. So if you recycle one battery to make one new battery, you will have an excess of cobalt today. And as they also shared, it only takes 166 smartphones to recycle enough cobalt to build a whole new EV battery. Yet only 17% of the 150 million devices Americans discard each year are recycled. So it's always fun to see those misinformed people that are screaming about cobalt in their EV batteries, and they are writing that post using their smartphone or laptop that are all using cobalt. Because here in 2024, it is expected that LFP batteries that does not have any cobalt in them will make up about 40% of the EV market, but in the phone industry, it is still 100%. But with just the cobalt from the batteries from the smartphones that are dumped every year in the US alone, you can make close to 1 million EVs running on lithium-ion batteries. Just from recycling smartphones, just in the US. Please let that one sink in, and don't tell all the misinformed people that the oil industry used cobalt to remove the sulfur when refining crude oil into gasoline, because cobalt is apparently only used for EVs and no other device, right? But luckily we are seeing a shift, and companies like Redwood is showing the way, as well as Tesla, that do recycle 100% of their own batteries. And we can see here how recycling batteries is expected to grow very fast over the next decade. So that will not only reduce the dependency on China, but also lower the prices for raw materials for batteries even more, as no expensive mining has to be done to get those raw materials. And here they even get the refined materials, so the future should look very bright on that front.
There's one other thing that's just worth focusing on, which is it partly about the chemistries? Is it partly about the types of batteries that Europeans chose? Now, a while ago, the EU, and to some extent parts of Asia outside of China, decided they were going to specialise in really high energy density batteries. The kind of thing that gives you really long range. And there's a particular type of chemistry here: nickel, manganese, cobalt. This is the high energy density stuff. China focused on low energy density batteries, a bit cheaper, a bit safer. And most people in Europe were like, well, why are you guys bothering? Because this stuff is where the money is. But look at what's happening now. Because China's got a lot better at making those batteries, you're seeing much more growth in that different chemistry. And the type of battery that the EU specialises in, it's basically plateauing. Look at that. And China's got the growth area. So you see, it's a whole range of different factors that have led to kind of where we are today with that leapfrogging chart.
Yes, the European also made a wrong bet on nickel, manganese, cobalt batteries, the high energy dense batteries, but the Chinese made a bigger investment in LFP batteries, and they have been rising the energy density too, so they are getting much better as well. But this is also the kind of batteries that Tesla is using in their standard range car. So over 50% of Tesla's batteries are already LFP batteries. So again, not using any cobalt. But that has made the European companies kind of stuck with their more expensive batteries. But that has not even made their cars more efficient, as I also showed in another video, as Volkswagen has only just started the LFP batteries in the ID.3, but only in China. But in Europe, they still don't. So Tesla's standard range Model 3 with the small 57 kWh LFP battery get 513 kilometers WLTP range, whereas the European ID.3 Pro S has got a lithium-ion battery of 77 kilowatt hours and only get 550 kilometers of range. So a much bigger battery that is also a much more energy dense type of battery in a much smaller car only gets 37 kilometers more range, or about 23 miles. It's not really that much. And the ID Pro S is embarrassingly costing about $3,000 more here in my country. And when someone like Tesla puts the more energy dense battery in their car, like the long range rear wheel version of the Model 3, that cost about the same as Volkswagen's ID.3 Pro S, they get over 700 kilometers of range in their much bigger car. So Tesla gets something like 20 to 25% more kilometers out of their cars with similar battery size and chemicals. But according to Bob Lutz, remember that? Tesla did not have any battery advantage compared to anyone else. No advantage whatsoever.
Tesla has no advantage, no technological advantage, no software advantage, no battery advantage, no advantages whatsoever.
Sure, Bobby. Try to take a look at this chart then, where you can see Tesla in the energy storage business is also dominating. You do find CATL on this list, who supplies Tesla with batteries, as one of the last green ones here. So again, it's not just about the hardware, it is Tesla's software that makes their battery storage system about 4 times better than CATL's own battery storage, according to this study, even using CATL's batteries. And we find BYD somewhere here in the middle in the gray zone, and Ford, GM and Volkswagen are also trying to copy what Tesla is doing. But as we can see, they are not very good at that either. They are all in the red zone, so not good at making EVs and not good at making battery storage, and Tesla is dominating both. Because they are innovating in both the hardware but also the software part, as Tesla has Autobidder, virtual machine mode, and their brand new site level controls. And no one else has all of this, as they are not software companies, but car manufacturers or battery manufacturers. But Tesla is a software company, but also a car and battery manufacturer. So they have all the know-how and the others don't.
But where we are also is that governments are trying to do something about it. You've got the US, Canada imposing 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. India as well, high tariffs. Turkey, the EU's just come in with tariffs as well. Really the only outlier here, apart from Japan, which mostly tends to buy Japanese, so you don't necessarily need as high tariffs, is the UK. Still, 0% on top of the normal tariff rate for Chinese EVs, making this about the most attractive country in the world to sell Chinese cars right now, especially given you've got that EV rule coming in 2035. Raising the question, what in the end will this spell for the UK car industry?
So now we know why the Chinese are starting to enter Europe with the UK, as there are no tariffs at all on their EVs getting into the country. But in the US, they're trying to block them with 100% tariffs, but it kind of feels a little hopeless right now when 65% of the EV market is in China anyway. But it will hold them at bay for a while, but eventually they will get into the US market as well and also become a dominating player there, as the old legacy automakers in the US is not doing a very good job at the transition to EVs fast enough, and don't have the economy of scale for their EVs as the Chinese have, on top of all the other benefits that they have just talked about with the batteries, labor, electricity and materials, all have lower cost in China. So this is such a big deal, and why the legacy automakers are doomed. Firstly, the shift from conventional engines to battery is a disruptive innovation that is draining the legacy automakers, and they started too late. As Clay Christensen also wrote about in his book Disrupting Class, by the time the new product becomes interesting to the incumbents' customers, it is too late for the incumbents to react to the new product. At this point, it is too late for the incumbent to keep up with the new entrant's rate of improvement, which by then is on the near vertical position of the S-curve trajectory. So the legacy automakers can't keep up with the likes of Tesla and BYD that are innovating too fast and has already hit the vertical part of the S-curve, while the old guys are still scrambling around down in the bottom. And the reason why Tesla is able to resist the pressure from the Chinese is they didn't start too late and have made even more innovations than the Chinese, as that is why they are basically the only one really earning money on selling EVs today, and why the price war in China that is really hurting the legacy automakers but also the local brands is not hurting Tesla as much, as they actually do have a margins on their cars to win this war. And secondly, China, and again Tesla as well, has invested heavily in battery technologies all the way down the supply chain for about 15 years. And as we have just seen, that is what the car industry is going to be all about in the future. And the legacy automakers are just waking up. And at the same time, we have all the things we just talked about with labor, electricity, and material cost, and the cost aspect of winding down the old ICE engines, retooling the old car factories for billions of dollars to make them into EV factories, and the fact that the old guy's product is still inferior and more expensive. These are all ingredients for the perfect storm that the legacy automakers are heading into. And thank you for watching. And until next time, take care out there and be nice.